I had a long week. I am worn out. I'm tired. You see, there's this little 9-year-old boy in Florida who has a terminal illness, and his last dying wish is to be remembered in the Guinness Book of Records for being the recipient of the most greeting cards in the whole world. And I was out collecting greeting cards for my little buddy Jimmy, and it was getting dark, and this car came towards me that didn't have its lights on. So I flashed my headlights at them, and the next thing I knew, my windshield was shattering, my back glass was shattering, and my car came to a complete stop. Turns out there's this gang that has an initiation where they ride around with their lights out, and when someone flashes their headlights on and off at them, they shoot them. Well, they managed to put a couple slugs into my engine block. So next day I was reading the want ads, and there I saw it. 1965 Chevy, $250. And I said to myself, well, that might just be able to get me down to Florida so I could deliver the thousands of greeting cards to my little buddy Jimmy so he could fulfill his dying wish and be remembered in the Guinness Book of Records for being the recipient of the most greeting cards in the whole world. So I called my friend and asked him to drive out and look at the 65 Chevy. He said he'd come right over, and I started watching the Phil Donahue show, and they had the president of a large corporation. I won't say which one. Don't ask me which one it was, because I'm not going to tell you. But they had the president of a large corporation on there saying his company's profits were being used to build satanic churches. Well, my friend honked his horn, and I told him I wasn't leaving till I threw out all my cake mix. And I took about 10 minutes to throw out my satanic cake mix, and I wish I would have waited, because when we finally arrived at that place where the 65 Chevy was advertised, we saw a 1965 cherry red Corvette in mint condition pulling out of the driveway. So we asked the little old lady if the 65 Chevy was still for sale, and she said she just sold it to a fella who stopped by 5 minutes ago, and he drove it out of the driveway just as we pulled in. Well, I was feeling pretty sad, having just missed out on a brand new 1965 Corvette for $250, and I was wondering how I was going to get my greeting cards down to Florida for my little buddy Jimmy so he could fulfill his dying wish and be remembered in the Guinness Book of Records as the recipient of the most greeting cards in the whole world. And we were driving back home on the highway, and we saw this car that had something on the roof. Well, we got a little closer and saw that it was a baby in a baby carrier. So we pulled up alongside this man and woman and said, "Hey, you got a baby on your roof." And they looked at us, and they looked at each other, and they looked at us, and pulled over to the side of the road. Turns out this young couple were on vacation with their baby when they got a call from home. So they turned right around and drove and drove and drove. And they had the baby sitting between them. And when the man got tired driving, he pulled over to the side of the highway, and they switched drivers. But when they did, the man put the baby on the roof so his wife could just slide over, and then he ran around to the passenger side and climbed in, and they took off and forgot about the baby on the roof. They said the reason they were in such a hurry to get home was that someone called and told them about a Corvette that was on sale for $75, and they were so grateful for telling them about the baby that they would just give us the address of the woman selling the Corvette, and from then on they'd start thinking more about their baby and start thinking less about Corvettes. So we were all set to look at the Corvette, but we had to run by the drugstore so my friend could get his pictures of his Jamaican vacation. So we picked up his pictures, and funny thing about those pictures, my friend and 3 of his buddies were vacationing in Jamaica. So one day they went down to the beach, and when they got back to their hotel room, everything was gone except their toothbrushes and my friend's camera. Well, they felt fortunate at the time because at least they could brush their teeth while they were in Jamaica. But when my friend got his film developed, there was this one picture of a fat Jamaican's rear end bending over for the camera with 4 toothbrush handles sticking out of it. I felt bad for my friend, but we couldn't linger on it, 'cause as soon as we got to his house, there was his Rottweiler with a dead rabbit at his feet. We got out of the car and looked at it, and it was his next-door neighbor's prized Belgian hare. Well, we couldn't have his neighbor lady coming down hard on my friend's Rottweiler, 'cause she was this old crazy woman with a beehive haircut, and you don't ever know what someone with a beehive haircut might do, 'cause if they're crazy enough to get a beehive haircut, then they're crazy enough to do just about anything. So we took the rabbit inside and washed the mud off of it and blow-dried it and propped it up in his cage just as his neighbor lady was pulling in the drive. We sneaked away before she could see us and went back to my friend's house when we heard an ungodly scream coming from his neighbor lady's yard. We ran over to her house, and his neighbor lady was in tears. So we asked what's the matter, and she said she buried her rabbit just that morning, and some sicko had gone and dug it up and put it back in its cage. Well, I rushed my friend along before some other lucky sucker came by and bought another Corvette before I could get my hands on it. So we rushed over to where a woman was selling a chartreuse Corvette with pink racing stripes for $75. Turns out the woman was a widow, and her husband had had a heart attack while sitting in his Corvette way out in a secluded fishing spot, and it was 6 months before anyone found him, and they never were able to get the smell out. Well, I sat in the driver's seat, and I had to stick my head outside because the smell was so strong. That's the only way a fellow could drive that car would be to stick his head out the window the whole time so he didn't have to breathe the smell. Well, there was no way I could buy that car because I couldn't drive all the way down to Florida to deliver my greeting cards to my little buddy Jimmy so that he could be remembered in the Guinness Book of Records as the recipient of the most greeting cards in the whole world with my head out the window all the time. And we had to get going because my friend works at the airport, and the day before they had a package that came in from New York City, and it got crushed, and when they opened it up they found a little black poodle inside. Well, my friend and his co-workers all felt bad, and my friend decided to make it up to the owner by finding a little black poodle and putting it in a new box for the owner because they all look alike. Not that all poodles look alike. Not all white poodles look like black poodles, but all white poodles look like every other white poodle, and all black poodles look like every other black poodle. And if you switch one on somebody, they never know the difference. So my friend and his co-workers paid good money for a little black poodle, and they fixed it up in a doggy crate just like the one that got crushed, and we went and delivered it to the kennel where the original package was being sent. But it turns out that the original poodle had got hit by a car in New York City, and the owner was having it sent to the pet cemetery that was run by the same people who ran the kennel. So when this woman bent down to open her package and that little poodle jumped out and licked her in the face, she fainted right on the spot. Well, we decided to get out of there before anyone could ask any questions, so we just started driving, and I said, hey, let's get my coat. Because, see, the night before, we were at this dance, my friend and I, and there was this pretty girl in a prom dress, and she danced with me, and she danced with my friend, and she danced real good, except she was real cold to touch. Well, she left without saying nothing to my friend and I, and when we left the dance and spotted the same girl walking down the road, well, we pulled over to give her a ride, and she got in the back seat, and I let her wear my coat. We took her to her mother's house and let her off, and I said she could wear the coat up to the house, and I'd pick it up the next day. Well, we just happened to be on the road where she lived, so we stopped by to get my coat. Her mother answered the door, and I told her why I was there, and she said we must be playing some kind of cruel joke because her only daughter died 25 years ago on the night of her prom. Well, I said she was the one playing the joke because we saw the girl just last night. So the mother walked us to the family plot to show us her tombstone, and there, on her daughter's tombstone, was my coat. Well, I didn't know what to say, and we stood there not saying a word, when all of a sudden we heard a loud noise, and we saw a cement truck pouring its cement into the next door neighbor's brand new Mazda Miata convertible. Turns out the neighbor owns a cement company, and it was his birthday, so his wife bought him a brand new Mazda Miata convertible and parked it in his driveway. And when he came home and saw a brand new Mazda Miata convertible parked in his driveway, he grew suspicious of his wife and went and dumped all his cement inside the convertible. So we took that moment to make our exit, and we were back on the road, and I was thinking about how I was going to get my postcards to my little buddy Jimmy so he could fulfill his dying wish and be remembered in the Guinness Book of Records for being the recipient of the most greeting cards in the whole world. And my friend mentioned his neighbor lady who has his beehive haircut and drives down to Florida from time to time, and he says maybe if I would give her some gas money and help her with the driving, maybe she would let me ride to Florida with her. Well, I didn't know about that because I always saw this woman spraying sugar water on her beehive haircut to keep it stiff, and I didn't know if I wanted to ride to Florida with a woman with a beehive haircut. But as we pulled in my friend's driveway, we saw the paramedics taking his neighbor lady to the morgue. So my friend asked them what happened, and they tell him they got a call because the neighbor lady collapsed in her driveway. And the first thing the paramedics did was cut open the beehive haircut, and when they did, roaches ran everywhere. Turns out that this woman sprayed sugar water on her beehive haircut to make it stand up, and the sugar water attracted roaches, and there were so many roaches that they sucked out her brains. Well, my friend went to check on his Rottweiler they left inside, and when he went in there, it was hacking and wheezing and hacking and wheezing and hacking and wheezing. So we threw the Rottweiler in the back seat and drove to the vet's, and the vet said he has something caught in his throat and he would remove it, and told us to go on home and relax. But when my friend was talking to the vet, I met this woman in the reception room who was getting her poodle fluffed. It turns out that just that morning she caught her husband with his secretary in a motel together, and she decided to fix him. She was going to sell his new Porsche for $50 to the first person who came by her house when she got home. And I said, hot dog, maybe this is a way I could drive all my cards down to Florida for my little buddy Jimmy so he could fulfill his dying wish and be remembered in the Guinness Book of World Records for receiving the most greeting cards in the whole world. So we went by my friend's house since it was on the way, and we pulled into the driveway, and the phone was ringing off the hook. So my friend said, well, by the time we get there, they'll hang up. So we just took our time, and the phone kept ringing off the hook. So my friend rushed in the house, and I followed behind him, and my friend picked up the phone, and it was the vet's office, and they said, get out of the house. And my friend said, why should we leave? We just got here. And the vet's office said, get out of the house. And my friend said, well, can you tell me why? And they said, get out of the house. So we moseyed on out the front door, and just then here came 3 squad cars and 3 paddy wagons, and the police ran right into the house, and there in the closet they found this serial killer who was in shock and bleeding from his hand. Turns out my friend's Rottweiler was choking on the serial killer's fingers. But we rushed out of there to see if that woman was still selling her husband's brand new Porsche for $50 so I could drive down to Florida to deliver those greeting cards to my little buddy Jimmy so he could fulfill his dying wish and be remembered in the Guinness Book of Records for being the recipient of the most greeting cards in the whole world. And sure enough, that woman signed her husband's brand new Porsche over to me for $50. And I know I should have called the insurance company before taking it for a ride, but it was getting late and I wasn't too far from this girl's house that I was kind of sweet on, and she wasn't really my girlfriend, but I'll call her my girlfriend anyway. So I drove by her house and she liked my Porsche and she got in, and we went out in the country where we could open it up a little bit, and it was getting dark and we were coming up on a curve, and this boy yells, "Pig!" And I thought he was talking about my girl. So I stuck my head out the window and looked at him, and I yelled, "So's your mother!" And just then, we collided with the hog crossing the road. Well, the Porsche was totaled, and I was kind of shook up, so my girlfriend went to get help, and I dozed off, and I was awakened by this tap, tap, tapping on the top of the Porsche. And I looked around, and I noticed it was dark out, and I wondered what happened to my girlfriend, and I dozed right back to sleep, and I was awakened by this tap, tap, tapping on the top of my Porsche. So I looked around, and it was pitch black out, and there was no sign of my girlfriend anywhere, and I went right back to sleep, only to be awakened by a policeman knocking on the window. And I noticed it was light out, and the policeman looked at me and said, "Get out of the car and don't look up." And I stretched my arms and shook my head, and I heard the policeman say, "Get out of the car and don't look up." And I got out of the car, and I was about to walk away when I heard this tap, tap, tapping on the top of my Porsche, and the policeman said, "Don't look up." And I turned and looked, and there was my girlfriend, hanging from a tree, a rope around her neck, her feet tap, tap, tapping on the top of my Porsche. The police say it happens all the time, but they don't tell us about it because they don't want us to panic. The police gave me a ride home, and when they dropped me off in my driveway, the phone was ringing off the hook. I took my time walking up the drive because I figured by the time I got to answer the phone, they'd hang up, but the phone kept ringing off the hook. So I just kind of trotted into my house, and the phone kept ringing off the hook. So I said hello, and it was my old fraternity brother calling from Mexico. Turns out that he and his family went on vacation with a sickly grandmother, and she went and died on them, and they didn't want to tell the Mexican authorities on account of all the red tape, so they stuffed her in the camper and were planning to drive her back over the border. But my fraternity brother and his wife were too upset to drive, so he wanted me to fly down to Mexico to drive him and his family and his grandma stuffed in the camper over the border into America. So I said, no problem. And not everyone knows this, but Garth Brooks sued the airlines a while back, and he decided to give his settlement to his fans who supported him over the years. So if you use his credit card, you can charge free airline tickets. So I charged a one-way ticket on Garth's account to Mexico, and I was on my way to Mexico, and in the middle of the flight, the pilot was talking kind of sweet-like to the stewardess, and all of a sudden, the co-pilot had to run to the bathroom, and when he did, the door locked behind him, and the pilot shook the door and shook the door and shook the door and tried to get back in, but the door was locked, and everyone started to panic. So I grabbed the emergency axe and chopped through the door, and we were on our way to Mexico, and we were able to fly right on into the Mexican airport, and I met my fraternity brother, and I started driving him and his family and his dead grandmother all the way to the border, and I drove and drove and drove, and out there in the middle of the Mexican desert were two black women next to a broken down Oldsmobile. Well, I just had to stop to see what was wrong. Turns out they just overheated, so we gave them some antifreeze and sent them on their way. And I didn't know it at the time, but those two women turned out to be Arsenio Hall's sister and mother. And when I got home, there would be a new Cadillac waiting for me in the driveway, sent by Arsenio for showing his gratitude for my helping his wife and mother who were stranded in the Mexican desert. But I didn't know it at the time. I kept driving and driving and driving until we drank all our water and ate all our peanut butter sandwiches, and the sun was getting hotter and hotter and hotter, and I was almost too hungry to keep on driving. When right in the middle of the desert, we saw this chili house. So we parked outside and went in and drank Coca-Cola and ate the best chili I ever ate, and we felt pretty good, and went outside to drive my fraternity brother's grandmother over the border. But when we came out of the chili house, someone had stolen my friend's camper that had his dead grandmother stuffed inside it. Why, I left my friend and his family at the embassy, and I charged another ticket to Garth Brooks' credit card, and before I knew it, I was flying back home holding my cactus. I bought this cactus in the airport. It was big, and I was able to get it for $1, and it was real neat because it would pulsate every now and then, just like it had a heart pumping inside it. And I was enjoying my cactus when I noticed the commotion. It seems that the pilot was talking to one of the stewardesses when the co-pilot got a case of Montezuma's Revenge and went rushing for the toilet. And when he did, the cockpit door locked behind him. Well, the pilot went and shook the handle and shook the handle and shook the handle. And I went to find the emergency axe, but the Mexicans done stole it while the plane was sitting at the airport. But fortunately, Chuck Norris was on board, and he kicked the door down, and the pilot was able to fly us home. And when I got to my house, there in the driveway was the new Cadillac that Arsenio Hall sent me for helping his sister and mother. And I brought my cactus inside and was about to take my Cadillac for a spin when I noticed my cactus was pulsating faster and faster. So I called a florist about the cactus, and they said, "Get out of the house." And I said, "What?" And they said, "Get out of the house." And I asked them what they were talking about, and the florist said, "Get out of the house." So I did, but as I was walking out the door, I turned and looked at my cactus just in time to see it explode, and millions of scorpions went flying through my house. Well, I got in my new Cadillac, and I called the exterminators on my new car phone, and I felt happy because now I had a way to get my greeting cards to Florida to give to my little buddy Jimmy, so that he could fulfill his last dying wish and be remembered in the Guinness Book of Records for being the recipient of the most greeting cards in the whole world. And I was thinking about that when I drove past the hospital where a world-famous actor, I won't say his name, don't ask me his name because I'm not going to tell you, but a world-famous actor had a hamster removed from his rear end. And I said, that reminds me, I got a date tonight. I started seeing this girl right before her birthday, and usually I break off relationships right before birthdays and before Christmas, so I don't have to buy them no gifts. And then about a month later, I call them up and say, "Honey, it must have just been your cycles making you grouchy. That's why we had to split up for a little bit." But I started going out with this girl just a few days before her birthday, and I said, "Well, isn't that my luck? I can't even break this off of her with her yet because I ain't got nothing off her anyway." So I had to break down and get her a present. So I went and got her a pair of really tight fitting jeans. And don't ask me the brand because I'm not going to tell you the brand name. But I went and got her a pair of tight fitting jeans. And I gave that to her, and she was going to wear them that night, but as it turns out, she wanted the jeans to fit even tighter. than they already fit, and they fit pretty tight. So she sat in a tub of hot water with her jeans on, and when I arrived at her house, the paramedics were taking her to the morgue on account of her jeans shrunk so much that it popped her guts all over the bathroom. Pow! Popped them on the mirror and on the toilet seat and right there in the tub. Police said it happens all the time, but they don't ever tell no one about it because they don't want us to panic. Well, I was feeling low, so I went to a tavern to get a shot of whiskey, and I was sitting at the bar, and the man came on the TV to call the lottery numbers, and I checked my ticket, and I checked it again, and then I looked away and checked it one more time, and I said, I won, I won, I won. And I showed it to the fella next to me, and he showed it to the fella next to him, and they passed my ticket around the bar. And when it got back to me, I noticed that it wasn't the same lottery ticket. Someone went and switched tickets on me. And I was yelling and screaming and threatening bodily harm when all of a sudden there was this huge explosion and we were all buried in a pile of debris. Turns out that in the same building as the tavern was this Pakistani proctologist who used to work for next to nothing, and he had a hemorrhoid patient that needed a scope stuck up his rear end, and the Pakistani doctor used this old cheap equipment he bought with him from the old country, and the scope happened to have a frayed wire, and it ignited a spark that lit the hemorrhoid sufferer's intestinal gases and caused a huge explosion that knocked down the tavern where I just won the lottery. Well, I dug my way out of the debris, and a crowd started to gather, and wouldn't you know it, my old fiancé was in the crowd of onlookers. We were all set to get married a long time ago, but my father-in-law-to-be got me real drunk at the bachelor party, and they had a stripper come in and dance on my lap, and they tried to tempt me, and I looked at her, and she looked at me, and I looked at her, and she looked at me, and I looked at her, and she looked at me, and I pulled off my clothes, and I was so drunk, we did it right there on the floor, and my father-in-law-to-be said, "You're not marrying my daughter," and canceled the wedding. She ended up marrying someone else. But one time he came home and caught her in bed with a black man, and he threw a $5 bill on the nightstand and said, "There you go, buddy, get yourself a good piece of ass," and walked out on her. She never saw him again. But I got to talking with her, and she invited me over to her apartment, and I said, "Sure, I'll drive my new Cadillac, the one I planned to drive to Florida to deliver the greeting cards to my little buddy Jimmy so he could fulfill his dying wish and enter the Guinness Book of Records as the recipient of the most greeting cards in the whole world." And I drove past the Kmart where those black boys cut off that little white boy's wee-wee a few years ago, and I had to go to the bathroom real bad, but I didn't dare use the Kmart bathroom. So I drove and drove till I came to this funeral home, and I said, well, I'll just pretend to be mourning the dead and then use their bathroom and slip out of there. So I signed the guest book, and I was the first mourner there. But it turns out I'd be the only mourner, and the deceased wrote out his will so that all his property would be divided between whoever attended his wake, and I was the only person there, so I inherited a small fortune. But I didn't know that at the time. At the time, the only thing I was thinking about was going to see my ex-fiancée at her apartment. So I drove my Cadillac over there, and I got in the elevator, and I rode up a couple of floors when this big black man with a cowboy hat on comes walking in with a white German Shepherd, and the door closes, and he says, "Sit, Whitey," and I sit on the floor. And he laughs out loud because he was talking to his dog. And I stand up and we start talking, and I soon found out I'm talking to Reggie Jackson, and I tell him I got a date with a girl in his building, and he recommends this restaurant across the street, and we say goodnight, and I go see my ex-fiancée in her 23rd story apartment, and she has on the prettiest blue dress you have ever seen, and she asked me to play with her Doberman Pinscher while she prettied herself up even more, and I bounce this dog his ball, and he brings it back to me, and I bounce him his ball again, and then I bounce it a little harder, and the ball goes out over the balcony, and the Doberman jumps after it and falls 23 stories. Just then my fiancée asked me what happened to her dog, and I say, you know, Sparky was looking kind of depressed. And right after I said that, we heard a car crash 23 stories down, and I said, that can't be my brand new Cadillac. And I look, and sure enough, someone hit my brand new Cadillac, and they're leaving a note on the windshield. So we take the elevator 23 stories and run out to read the note, and I thought it might be the man's phone number and insurance company. So I read the note, and all it says is, have a nice day, sucker. So I'm upset because my brand new Cadillac, the one I was going to drive to Florida to deliver the greeting cards to my little buddy Jimmy so he can fulfill his dying wish and be remembered in the Guinness Book of Records as the recipient of the most greeting cards in the whole world, my brand new Cadillac was already damaged. So we call the police and tell them about the hit and run, and they fill out a report, and then we notice we're standing outside the restaurant Reggie Jackson told us about. And we go in, and they give us a great table, and when dinner is over, we find out Reggie Jackson paid for our meal. And I tell my ex-fiancée all about my little buddy Jimmy, whose last dying wish is to be remembered in the Guinness Book of Records as the recipient of the most greeting cards in the whole world. And she says she wants to check on her dog, because I never had a chance to tell her about what happened to Sparky, and she gets up from the table and drops over dead. Turns out she bought that pretty blue dress at a resale shop, and it belonged to a Puerto Rican girl who died and was going to be buried, but after the funeral, her family took it off her and sold it to the resale shop. And the resale shop sold it not knowing that it was full of formaldehyde, and when my ex-fiancée shaved her legs, she got a lot of little cuts on her legs, and when she put on the formaldehyde dress, the formaldehyde seeped into her cuts, and not long after that, she was history. Police said it happens all the time, but they don't tell us about it because they don't want us to panic. Well, I got into my Cadillac and I tried starting it, but the wreck knocked some wiring loose. So I had it towed and checked into a nearby hotel, and I got on the elevator of the hotel when a whole bunch of black men got on, and one of them said, hit the floor. So I dove on the floor, and they all laughed and laughed and laughed. Turns out the man who said hit the floor was Eddie Murphy, and those other men were his bodyguards. Well, Eddie told me that he was instructing one of his bodyguards to press the elevator button, and we got to talking, and Eddie recommended that I eat at this nearby restaurant, so I did, and when I went to pay for my meal, I found out that Eddie picked up the tab. And when I was eating at this restaurant, I asked the waitress if she would like to go out for coffee, and she said yes, and it was love at first sight. And we went out, and I got coffee, and she got a certain brand of soda. Don't ask me which kind, because I'm not going to tell you what kind it is, but she got a certain brand of soda. and I told her all about my little buddy Jimmy, who was dying of a rare disease down in Florida, and his last dying wish was to be remembered in the Guinness Book of Records as the recipient of the most greeting cards in the whole world. And she was so moved by my mission that she offered to drive me to Florida then and there, and I was all set to go when she pulled out some Pop Rocks candy, and she threw the candy in her mouth, and then she downed all of the soda. Don't ask me which kind, because I'm not going to tell you the brand name, so don't ask me which kind, but she downed all the soda in one swallow, and we got up to pay our bill and get on the road to Florida when all of a sudden her stomach exploded. Boom! Her guts went all over the restaurant. All because she mixed Pop Rocks candy in a certain brand of soda. Police said it happens all the time, but they don't tell us about it because they don't want us to panic. So I was sitting at home wondering how I was going to get my greeting cards to my little buddy Jimmy when my grandpa called and said that we could drive to Florida in his new Winnebago. And I was pleased to be informed of this development, and I went and loaded all my greeting cards up and put them in the Winnebago, and I drove and drove and drove until I got tired, and I let my grandpa drive while I went to sleep in the back of the Winnebago, and I was snoozing pretty good until my grandpa decided to put the Winnebago on cruise control and went back to the trailer area to fix some coffee. So he put it on cruise control thinking he'd get back before we hit a curve in the road, but we hit a curve in the road before he could get back to the driver's seat. Well, no one got hurt, but the Winnebago was totaled and my postcards for my little buddy Jimmy were everywhere. So we loaded up the postcards and headed home, and I was wondering how I was going to get the postcards to my little buddy Jimmy so he could fulfill his dying wish and be remembered in the Guinness Book of Records as the recipient of the most greeting cards in the whole world. And I was sitting out home looking out my kitchen window, and there I see my neighbor trying to cut his hedge, but the hedge trimmer doesn't work. So he and his buddy grab a lawnmower, and they get on each side of the hedge, and they start trimming the hedge that way, when all of a sudden something happens and the lawnmower jerked, and both of them are bleeding from the hands, and all 16 fingers are on the lawn. Well, I called an ambulance and gathered up all 16 fingers and had them ready for the ambulance drivers, and they were able to reattach all of them on the correct hands. Well, my neighbor was so grateful for what I had done that he said he would loan me his new Chrysler to drive to Florida to deliver my greeting cards to my little buddy Jimmy so he could fulfill his dying wish and be remembered in the Guinness Book of Records as the recipient of the most greeting cards in the whole world. Well, I had those cards in that Chrysler in a jiffy, except there were so many cards. The crate they were in stuck out the driver's side window, and I was on my way to Florida with the crate sticking out the driver's side window when I saw the chartreuse Corvette with pink racing stripes moving toward me at a high rate of speed. And I noticed the driver had his head stuck out the window, and when he went past, his head hit my little buddy Jimmy's box of greeting cards and cut his head right off. Completely. All the way. Decapitated. Off at the shoulders. Police said it happens all the time, but we don't hear nothing about it because they don't want us to panic. Well, I was ready to set out for Florida once again when I find out that in order for little Jimmy to qualify for the Guinness Book of Records, he had to receive his greeting cards through the mail. And I was wondering how I was going to afford all that postage, and no sooner had I wondered that than the mailman came by and delivered my inheritance check for being the only mourner at that man's funeral, and the check was just enough to cover the postage to send all my greeting cards to my little buddy Jimmy so he could fulfill his dying wish and be remembered in the Guinness Book of Records as the recipient of the most greeting cards in the whole world. So I licked and licked and licked and got those cards in the mail when I found out the CIA had slipped a drug into postage stamps, to make the people who licked them turned into Republicans. So I am now the most Republican man in the whole world. And that's why I'm so tired. Because as soon as I licked all those stamps, I had this overwhelming impulse to rush out and buy a Jesse Helms inflatable doll. And I got my Jesse Helms inflatable doll, and it's rutting season at my house. And we rutted, and we rutted, and we rutted, and I thought I had about as much fun as I could possibly have with my Jesse Helms inflatable doll when I found this opening halfway up his back that said, "Insert batteries here." And I inserted 6 of those big round batteries in there, and my Jesse Helms inflatable doll sat up and said, "Pull my finger." And I didn't waste any time to pull his finger, and that was 3 days ago, and I haven't gotten a wink of sleep since then. So the moral of the story is, get a good night's rest and take all your vitamins before you pull on Jesse Helms' finger.